Here we go again. There's a button here somewhere. There we go. All right. Great to see you. It's good to be here. I realize now that having me come to speak after the one church moment was a practical joke on me, I guess. An exercise of humility in terms of preaching. It was quite an energetic message last week. It was fantastic, and for those of you who were there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You are not going to get a sermon like that today. Sorry. I was inspired, but not enough to be able to do that. So anyway, we're going to continue on with our series in Hebrews 11, the By Faith series, and this has just been a fantastic series to remind us that the core of everything in our lives is anchored in faith. And this has always been the tension and the struggle within the church. People want to focus on works, which is important. People want to focus all on faith and not works. And somewhere in that, we need to find, what does the Bible teach us about the power of faith in our lives and how that actually makes the invisible reality of God and His kingdom visible in this world by faith. And I want to talk about that today with respect to Moses. I get the Moses section of this passage in Hebrews 11. And as I was preparing for this, I just kept being reminded of the words of Paul, who said we need to walk by faith, not by sight, in 2 Corinthians. And that is the challenge for all of us. Whether it's Paul's day 2,000 years ago, whether it's us here in this place today, the challenge for us is to walk by faith, not by sight. We are people who just have a focus on believing what we see. And I was reminded of an experience. Maybe as I get older, I do more reminiscing, but I was thinking back when I was at ABC doing my undergrad, and I grew up in a carpenter family. My grandfather was a carpenter, my dad was a carpenter. So guess what I did every summer, right? I went and did carpentry. So anyway, when I got to university, I figured, well, that might be a good way to try to put my way through school. So one summer, I was at Highfield Baptist at that time, and Don Buston, some of you know Don, of course, knew Don. Great guy, great sense of humor. So I was doing some renovations at his cottage, and one day he had sent me to get some building supplies, and I left him my little car. And then he had to go somewhere, and I forgot to tell Don that my gas gauge was broken, and it was perpetually stuck on empty. I mean, the tank was full, but the gauge read empty. And Don had a good laugh at that and poked me a little bit about that I must have bought the car from a pastor because it forced him to drive by faith the whole time to town and back. And, but that is an analogy, really, of how we are to live life. Sometimes things don't look like what our faith tells us we need to live into. Sometimes we can get afraid of our circumstances. We can look around us, and the world is telling us one thing, but we know that God is telling us something else. And we need to make a choice. Are we going to live by faith, or are we going to walk by sight? And this series is really all about walking by faith and what God does when we walk by faith. I was reminded again as I was doing my readings on that story of Thomas, because Thomas is really the seeing is believing disciple, isn't he? He believes Jesus. He loves Jesus. He followed Jesus. He was willing to take all the criticisms that the religious establishment was hurling at Jesus. He was there. He was faithful. He was walking with Jesus. But when the story of the resurrection came to him, it was not about faith at that time. It was about seeing. And of course, we know the end of that story, because Thomas, at the end of that story, is declaring Jesus to be his Lord and his God. And Jesus says to him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." You see, there's the true blessing, but it's also the real challenge for us to believe when what we're seeing seems to be, well, saying something different. And I think that seeing is believing is really part of the human condition. Our basic instinct is to only believe what we can see, what we can verify. And yet it seems as we read through this chapter of Hebrews that the very thing that God is asking of us is to believe even when we don't see. He was asking Noah to build a boat when they hadn't even experienced rain yet. He was asking Abram to leave his homeland with his security, with his family, with everything that was the world to him, and to leave and go to a place that God didn't even tell him where it was yet. And it was by faith that he went. And now we have Moses, but then we move to Thomas, and then of course Jesus extends that even to us. Blessed are those who believe and do not see. I'm calling my message today, Faith Sees More. Faith sees more. Let's look at our passage from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 to 27. I'll be reading from the NIV. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Well, let's walk through this passage. I just want to draw a couple of things out. And you know what? Despite Carolyn's prayer and I'm going to preach a really simple message. And it's a message that you can read in a business book, that you can read in almost all the self-help books at the chapters. This is not complicated. It's just simply an anecdotal reality about life and leadership and going forward. Except the one difference that the Hebrews 11 passage is teaching us is that we need to anchor these just basic truths in faith. Because when we anchor this development in faith, everything else changes. My first point is that faith leads to vision. Faith leads to vision. When we have faith in God, when we believe the things that God tells us, it gives us a vision for life. It gives us a vision for the future. I mean, we sing songs about following Jesus. Well, if you don't have a vision of Jesus, how are you going to follow him? You have to see where he's going in order to follow him. This is pretty basic stuff. I know it's not an aha moment for you, but the thing is that we need to understand that faith leads to vision, and we all have a vision of life. Some of us allow that vision to, create our trajectory forward and move along forward. Others just have a particular vision of life. Maybe it's a defeatist vision of life, where it doesn't matter what I do, nothing will ever change, and that's your vision of life. That's your vision for life. And then you start building your life around that vision. Whatever anchors your vision will create your trajectory. And the Bible tells us we need to anchor that vision in faith. It is by faith that Noah did what Noah did. It is by faith that Abram did what Abraham did. It is by faith that Moses did what he did. But before we even get to Moses, we're reminded here of Moses' parents, who hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was no ordinary child. Well, how did they see that? I mean, every parent sees their child as no ordinary child, right? I mean, I remember when one of my kids, I won't say which, so I don't want to create any embarrassment, but I remember in the hospital when one of my children was born, and a family member came in and said under their breath, "What an ugly child," right? And now as I look at the pictures, I don't know. But in the moment, no way, right? No way. I mean, this is the parental thing. You give your life for your kids. You do anything for them, and you don't like it when someone comes in and says things like that. Well, the point is that Moses' parents saw something more than just the ordinary thing that parents see in their kids. They saw that he was, some translations say that he was beautiful. But the word that's used there, it speaks to something more. It speaks to the potential. It speaks to the future of that person. They saw something in that child that was not an ordinary child. And they hid him. And of course, when you're reading this, you'd think, well, yes, of course they hid him. They were parents. They loved their child. They hid him. But we, in the safety of Canada and our structures and all that we have, can understand, we have a particular bravery, I guess. When they're coming to your door and they're knocking on the door looking for people, sometimes fear is greater than these other instincts that we have. And we've seen that in the past, even in human history. And so it did take bravery. It did take commitment. It was a challenge for the parents to keep the child hidden. Of course, we read in the book account in Exodus that it's not just the parents. There were midwives involved there, and in the Hebrew text anyway, it's mostly the mother who was orchestrating this. But in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's the parents. It refers to both the parents of Moses who were engaged in this activity to protect their child. They saw things differently. They saw the power of Egypt, but they had faith in God. They saw something that God was going to do in this child, and they were willing to risk their very lives to protect that child. They saw things differently. Faith leads to vision. They saw that he was no ordinary child. So they were willing to stand against tyranny, against violent power, because they saw something different about Moses. And of course, it was that difference of vision that saved Moses' life, and ultimately, by extension, that saved Israel. So I guess the aside comment I want to make about that is that we always want to talk about the hero of the story, and we sort of forget about all the people who made that person into the hero they became. I mean, we get one line about Moses' parents saving his life for 3 months, right? And who knows what perils were in the mix as they did this. We read all about Moses and all the things that Moses did. We know all of his character flaws. We know all of his strengths. We know his passion for God. We know his meeting with God on the mountain, receiving the law. We know all about Moses. We know one line about his parents. But without his parents, there'd be no Moses. I mean, obviously biologically, but even beyond that, to save his life, because they saw something different. They had a different vision. At this point in the story, the great leader of Israel, Moses, is just a helpless child, and he's saved by his parents. And then we know from Exodus and others who had a similar vision. We don't need to chase the limelight. We need to be faithful. God may not call us to climb Mount Sinai and receive the law. God may not be calling us to lead the nation out of slavery, but God may be calling us to be the friend of the person who's going to do that. To be the person who prays for the person who's going to do something great. And you know what? You're part of that story. We should never, we just have this tendency to look at the heroes and think that nothing else matters. Moses' parents mattered in this story. And the writer of Hebrews draws that out. By faith, Moses' parents saw that he was no ordinary child, and they did everything they could and hid him for 3 months. And then they orchestrated a plan, of course, as we read Exodus, where he would be adopted into the royal family. In the book, Among Friends, Who We Like, Why We Like Them, and What We Do for Them, the author, Letty Cotton Porgrebin, interviewed a whole bunch of people about what a real friend really means. And several respondents, particularly those who had family histories tied to World War II, clearly stated, a friend is someone who would hide me from the Nazis. And I remember Warren Buffett actually talking about a friend of his in Omaha, a woman who had actually survived the Holocaust. And that's how she looked at people in her friendship circle. Would they hide me? What a question. I mean, it's good to have some friends who would hide you, but it's also important to be the person who would hide a person. To be like Moses' parents, willing to take the risk because you see things differently, because you have a different vision. Faith leads to vision. Faith sees more. But once we have that vision, the first thing we see, and again, this is pretty bland stuff, but vision leads to values, right? Once we see things differently, and we can't unsee that, it changes what we think is important. It changes our value system. We start ordering things differently in our lives. I was reminded of how important vision is. This week, I went to get my eyes tested, as I do, but my eye doctor said, "You haven't been here since 2021. I said, "Oh, okay." And then I went to get glasses, and they said, "You haven't got new glasses since 2019. So I don't know if that's good or if I've just been missing a lot, but anyway, I went back. But I was reminded, because I was working on this message already, and as I went to pick out new frames, and I realized the irony of needing to pick out frames when you wear glasses, right? I mean, you pick, oh, that looks nice, I'll try those on. So you take off your glasses, and you try to find your face to get them on, and you still can't see anything, and now you're required to pick out whether or not these look good on you, right? There we go, I can see you again. Anyway, I was just reminded, this is ridiculous. How am I supposed to be able to pick glasses for myself when I can't even see myself when I take my glasses off to try on the new frames? Anyway, the importance of vision. Very important to see things clearly. I mean, I made a fuzzy judgment. We'll see maybe in a couple of weeks whether it was a smart choice or not. Anyway, we'll see. But yeah, vision leads to values. When we see things differently, we make different choices. We order our lives differently. And we read in this text that the writer of Hebrews is clearly making a connection between Moses and Jesus. This is a standard connection throughout the New Testament. The Gospel of Matthew is making this over and over and over again. Jesus is the sort of the ultimate revealer of God's truth. The book is divided up into 5 sections, the Gospel of Matthew. The writer of Hebrews is a Jewish person who really holds in high regard Moses. And yet he's framing Moses in light of Christ. He refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter. He instead chose to identify with those who were being mistreated, the slaves. It would have been so easy for him to take the easy path and to rationalize that. You can think of 10 reasons on the spot why a person would say, well, if I stay in the royal house, I'll have influence in the royal house. And I'll be able to sit around the table and try to get people to have a more just relationship with our Hebrew slaves, who we pay nothing and beat relentlessly to do the things that make us happy, right? There is a sense in which you could rationalize the influence you'd have, the power you would have. You could do good things. But Moses saw that as being complicit in the sin of Egypt. And so, it might be pleasure, but it would be fleeting pleasure of sin, he calls it. We're reminded of Jesus, who, when he preached his first message in Nazareth, he said, I've come to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. Luke 4:18. For Jesus, they criticized him for associating with women, tax collectors, and sinners. It would have been so easy for Moses to just simply stay where he was, enjoy the good life, try to do some occasionally influential things to make life a little more bearable for the Hebrew slaves, and just sort of sidestepped all of the harshness that was to come for him of leading a stubborn people into the place where God had prepared for them. But staying silent wasn't an option for Moses, because, as we read in this text, by faith, Moses had faith. By faith brought him a vision. He saw things differently. And because he saw things differently, he had to do things differently. And because he did things differently, he made different choices. What do we value ultimately? Do we value the words of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, the truth that he saw so clearly and tried to explain to us? Or do we assign greater value to something else? Juliana challenged us a few weeks ago about that one thing in our lives that would be very difficult for us to lay before the feet of Jesus. And that for all of us, there's something. For that rich young ruler, it was his riches. We don't know how that story ends. Tradition says that was Barnabas, and he ended up selling all his stuff and following Jesus. But we don't know how the story ends. That's just tradition. The fact is at that moment, he had a moment of crisis, because Jesus asked him to give up the one thing that he wanted to hold on to. And there's something there for all of us. And we're saved by grace through faith, not by works. It's not about us having everything perfectly attuned. That's not going to happen. That'll happen in the resurrection. So it will happen. I want to give you hope. But until that time, it's like we sang, he is our defense. He is our righteousness. Christ. And that's by faith. But we're called to follow him. We're followed to convert our vision to values and our values to action. Because true values never remain abstract. They eventually move our feet and our hands, and we see this in this text in verses 27-28. We see Moses translates his values into a decisive and risky historical action. By faith, he left Egypt. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood. All these stories about the Passover, all the stories about freeing the slaves, Israel as slaves in Egypt, which is every year they would celebrate and remember again that they were once slaves in Egypt. That was part of Israel's identity. Moses walked out on the power of empire, and he chose to be with the oppressed people of God, to walk with them and to lead them. Even though they were stubborn and didn't want to listen to him, he chose to follow God by faith. By faith, Moses had a vision. By faith, that vision turned his values on their head, and those values were converted into action. And he changed everything for the nation of Israel by this simple progression. And the fact is that every vision leads to values, and all values lead to action. This is not a spiritual thing. This is just reality. The spiritual piece is making sure that the piece that governs it all is faith. Faith in Jesus Christ. When faith is what governs the whole thing, our vision is different than a person whose whole thing is governed by, I'm going to get as much as I can out of this life, and I'm going to squeeze it and wring it out, and I'm going to get everything I can out of it. That vision is one that's willing to step on other people and willing to just trudge onward ahead for whatever betters themselves. And that will convert into actions. Vision leads to values, which lead to action, and it doesn't matter what that vision is, that will always be true, but God's word tells us we must anchor that process in faith. Faith in Jesus Christ, who defines the kingdom for us, what is real and not real, what is delusion and what is true. At the end of Jesus' great sermon, he compares the people to those who build their house on sand and those who build their house on a rock, and we sing children's songs about it and all the rest. And what we sometimes forget is that final teaching of Jesus in the sermon, that wise person who builds their house on a rock is the person who hears my teaching and does it. Vision, values, action. That's the connection. It is true in us. Jesus says that we are to anchor our vision in him, in his way, in his kingdom. And Jesus says to us, I have overcome the world. And he can overcome the world in each of us. He can give each of us a new vision of what is real and what is unreal. A clear vision of the kingdom of God, a vision that shapes new values, kingdom values. And those values, by his Spirit, converts to real action that make real difference in this world by faith. And I want to circle back to the story of Thomas when he encountered the risen Jesus, because at the end of the story, when he saw Jesus, his eyes were opened spiritually, and he believed. He saw Jesus not just as Jesus the great teacher, Jesus the miracle worker, Jesus the friend of sinners, Jesus the critic of oppressors. Jesus was all those things, but now he saw something more. He saw Jesus who had overcome the world, who had conquered death. And he falls to his knees and he cries out, "My Lord and my God." What does your faith see when you see Jesus? Do you see the teacher? Do you see the occasional miracle worker? Do you see the person who's bringing religious reform? Or do you see the one who has conquered death itself? Do you see the Jesus who has overcome the world? Which Thomas will we be? The one who says, if I see it, I'll believe it. Or the one who by faith has their whole life transformed because of what is actually true. And we don't have to see it to know it's true. And we see glimpses. We may not see everything, but we see glimpses all through life. We see lives changed. We see people healed of trauma. We see so much of God at work. And God just simply says to us, have faith. I've got this. Where are you today? when we get to the end of our lives, will people look to us and say, by faith, and talk about our life? What will they say? I'm sure they'll say lots of things. But I hope that one of the things that is said for each and every one of us is that our life was marked by our faith in Jesus Christ. That faith brought new vision. That faith brought new values. And that faith gave us the power and the hope and the desire to do things that we would never otherwise do. Because faith sees more. Amen.